Welcome everybody again to the Curriculum Matters Learning and Advocacy Series. We are so excited that you're here for our fourth session. And the goal of this entire series, well, we have two here. One is to improve equitable access to standards-aligned high-quality curriculum in instruction, specifically for students of color, low-income students, and English learners. And we are trying to uplift the need for equity to be a driving force in the math framework and the upcoming adopted materials list development process, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. All right. And so this is our definition when we think about what high quality instructional materials really mean. So we have 4 different sections, and our series so far has kind of covered each of these sections in more detail. Again, we started talking about how high quality instructional materials mean standards aligned. For this series, we specifically are talking about the California Common Core State Standards because this is about the California framework. But for us, when we're talking about grade materials, they have to be standards aligned. The other one that's really important is that materials should be user-friendly, accessible to folks who need to be able to use these materials day to day, so for our teachers and for our students. High-quality instructional materials should also be culturally relevant. So we learned more about this in our previous session with Unbound Ed, but it's really important that HQIM fits into the conversation about how teaching and pedagogy and curriculum theories, attitudes, and practices really center student identities and culture and context within educational system. And so if you're interested in learning more about any of those pieces, we do have some videos from prior sessions that we can share as well. And really excited again for this session that's going to focus on that final piece of the puzzle. Grade materials, high quality instructional materials need to support English learners' access to grade level content. And ELSF will speak to it much better than I can, but we all very strongly believe that our students who are learning English cannot be barred from access to rigorous content as they are learning the language simultaneously. So excited to hear more about best practices and how curriculum and instructional materials fit into this. But throughout the series, you'll hear high quality instructional materials. For us, this is what we mean when we say that term. And I am so excited to introduce our special guest for today. Leyla Bravo is the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Initiatives at English Learner Success Forum, or ELSF. She'll be guiding our section about how instructional materials can really support English learners in the classroom. So really excited and grateful for you being here today.
Welcome. My name is Leyla Bravo. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Initiatives at the EL Success Forum. And we are here for advocating for English learner success. A little background on me. I have been on the ground for about 17 years as a teacher, a leader, a school leader, opened up a school, director of new teacher development, and now in this role. And I am also a English learner myself, a refugee of Nicaragua, and a mother of 2 beautiful bilingual girls that would also benefit from all of this work. So I am here in front of you to advocate for all of those folks, including my sisters and my own girls. So let's start just by sharing a little bit about what ELSF does. Next slide, please. So core to our mission is ensuring that the supply of instructional materials that are inclusive of English learners makes it out to teachers and students. That's really what we're about, and we have worked with tons of content developers to try to improve their own products. We've also worked with states and districts, on the other hand, to help and support them in being able to identify what great instructional materials really looks like that is inclusive of English learners and that gives them all the supports they need to be successful in the classroom. Next slide, please. Ultimately, our mission is about equity and access. We know that all students deserve it, and English learners are no different. Just 2 clicks, please. Specifically, if you notice, we are also using the term English learners. And the reason we are doing that, just to frame that, is under the umbrella topic of multilingual learners, English learners specifically, our real focus is to make sure that English learners have equity and access. And what that means is we're honing in on English learners to focus on their access to grade level content. We know that in the classroom, they're going to be in ELA in math, and we want to make sure that they are getting everything they need. Next slide, please. So we want to focus in on two questions. One, how can we center the needs of English language learners in the adoption of materials? And two, how do we ensure that California asks for curriculum that meets the needs of English learners? So I want to start by framing a little bit about what's happening in California, what the gaps and the opportunities are. Next, 2 slides. So 1 in 5 students in California is an English learner. That's 1.15 million students. That's a huge opportunity if we are able to capitalize on that. Next slide, please. The unfortunate part is that the academic achievement of English learners in California is lagging. Obviously, to no fault of the students or teachers. There's a missing piece in this. There's a large achievement gap. Next slide. On top of this, more than 70% of teachers report that they have received inadequate preparation to effectively teach English learners. Next slide. So we actually got a chance. To do some research as well in collaboration. And this research was also published by Education Trust West, and we thank them for their partnership in this. And we asked the question, how well prepared do teachers feel to teach English learners? And this is what we have found so far. 32%, nearly 70% of teachers do not feel fully prepared to teach English learners. We also noticed that 64% of teachers do not regularly use provided materials. What we see is that there is a significant potential for educative materials to support teachers in providing high quality learning experiences for English learners. Next slide, please. Educators also believe that their instructional materials are not designed with English learners in mind. Again, our research confirms this. Only 18% of math teachers can truly rely on their materials to help tailor the instructions for English learners. And over 50% of teachers cannot rely on their materials to provide scaffolds for listening or writing. We see similar trends in ELA, though a little more positive, at about 30% rely on their materials. What are 1 to 2 things you could advocate for so that instructional materials can be more effective in serving English learners? What would you want materials to have so that they can support teachers to support students? So I see explicit instructions on ways to observe and encourage students' use of language, listen fors, naming what teachers should listen for, again, use and acceptance of languages, supporting language development and content development at the same time, experiential activities, these are great, clear language objectives. All right, and student discussion and reflection. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And I'm going to get a chance to share with you all. One of the tools that English Learner Success Forum has developed is called the benchmarks of quality. A lot of what you all are saying here is in these benchmarks. And this tool really names the 5 critical design features in instructional materials that attend to English learners' assets and needs. The 5 listed are language and content integration, so what many of you named, scaffolding, language and learning, metacognition and metalinguistic awareness, assets and strengths-based learning, again, many of the things that you all named, and assessment of content and language. So if we go to the next slide, we're also going to drop in the chat our tool, a high-level indication of our tool, benchmarks of quality. And what I would love for you to do is take a minute to read through these benchmarks of quality specifically for math. It's also handout 3 in your participant folder. And as you read, I want you to think about how you could use these to improve material selection, or one thing that stands out to you in these benchmarks that you think is really, really positive. So I'll give you a minute to read and then put that in the chat. And when you're ready, add in ways that these can improve the material selection process. So I see Manuel is sharing the use of appropriate assessments that capture content knowledge is critical for multilingual students. Absolutely. I love that, John. Yes, the assets students bring are teaching resources. Content and language over time. Yes, Maria, absolutely. Yes, this also outlines that students should be active participants, appropriate scaffolds. So we're going to go to the next slide. And I just want to share now, we at this point know that academic achievement for English learners is not where it needs to be. We know that teachers feel like they're not sufficiently prepared for the task. And we know that instructional materials can play a critical role in supporting teachers to support our students. So what is getting in the way of adopting high quality instructional materials that are inclusive of English learners? I want to share some of those barriers. If you can go to the next slide, so we can move the needle on adoption processes. So often what we've been seeing in the field are the following. Sometimes processes are very bureaucratic. So there's fast-paced decision-making on instructional materials, and so it's not always an inclusive process. What we're hoping to see as a shift in that is, next slide, please. Using the adoption process as actually a learning opportunity and a consensus building opportunity. So we can use adoptions as a point where people learn about what is inclusive, what is support for English learners really look like. Next slide. The other thing that we're seeing that is getting in the way as a barrier is this siloing at a state and district level. Oftentimes what happens, and this is not every district, but what happens is that EL specialists are consulted on the back end about instructional materials and not from the very beginning. And what our recommendation really is, next slide, next click, is that it is all staff are trained on what kind of English learner supports show up in instructional materials, whether they're EL specialists or not, whether they're math specific, ELA specific, everyone should know what to look for in curriculum. Next. And often in the actual criteria, there's very little said about English learners. Sometimes it's one line that says, it is inclusive of English learners, without really defining what that means. And what we're really advocating for, next slide, is embedded criteria. So when we say embedded criteria, what we mean by that is within the criteria that is already established, really embedding this idea of language and content being learned simultaneously and outlining what that actually looks like in curriculum. So I'm going to illustrate a little more on this. Next slide. Next. So we're going to share some quotes from, if you can go back to the quote, we're going to share a few quotes on a session that we did with Pivot Learning. and some after we shared what these benchmarks actually look like. And in this quote, I used to think that California approved math curriculum that had high quality embedded language supports. Now I think we will need to do a review using a rubric to see what how high quality those materials are. In the chat, can you share just really quickly, how well do you think right now California vets materials for English learner supports? So I'm seeing minimally, not very well, +1 to Shelley, very little, if at all. And so really what we're advocating for in the next slide is kind of changing this scenario. So moving from little or no criteria to really embedded criteria. And there are 3 ways that we want to talk about that. And if you can click through the 3, and this is at the state level. So we're really looking right now, the place that we are at right now is a framework. And what we're really advocating for is that the framework embeds and explicitly outlines what supports are needed in curriculum for English learners, specifically in Chapter 13. We're also suggesting that the Instructional Quality Commission explicitly embeds criteria for English learners in guidance to publishers, and that request for proposals specifically shares with publishers what kind of English learner supports are necessary to be considered for the state. Oftentimes, when the state puts their foot down and says these things have to be in our materials, publishers will respond and they will change and adapt their materials as needed to do that. Next slide, please. I used to think that I knew what to look for in supports for English learners. Now I think I have a better understanding of what we should be looking for. Question to you all. The folks that are reviewing the materials, how well do you think that they either have English learner development expertise, or how well do you think that, or how well do you understand the process of how reviewers are selected untrained? Thank you, Rachel. Very little training or no training when you participate in the curriculum adoption at a district level. Okay, let's go to the next slide. There's an opportunity here to really make sure that we change the process from consulting ELD specialists at the back end to making sure all staff are trained. And this can happen both at the state level and at the district level. And so there are a few opportunities here. You can click through all of them. So making sure that the percentage of reviewers selected have expertise on English language development and how this shows up in curriculum. Folks can have expertise on English language development, but it's also really important to understand how curriculum can do that as well. And that all reviewers are trained on the design features that curriculum can bring. There's also the development of a rubric, right? And that rubric needs to have really robust metrics to make sure that materials support English learners. Next slide. I'll let you read that quote just really quickly, and then we'll go to the next slide. Next slide. So there's also an opportunity to make sure that EL support, go from EL supports being an add-on in curriculum to making sure that they're integrated in the design so that there's simultaneous language and content learning. And this can happen at the state level and at the county level, especially supporting districts with guidance. And so our recommendations include guidance to districts on what great English learner design looks like in curriculum, and guidance to districts on supports available in each curriculum on the state list. So state list will come out, and as we saw in a previous quote, making sure that that state list has a curriculum that has great English learner supports, and also sharing what kind of supports it has and what it doesn't. Curriculum is never perfect, but it can be really powerful, and it depends on your students. Okay, next slide. So how did we do? Today, we talked a little bit about how we can center the needs of English learners in the adoption of materials, and how do we ensure California asks for curriculum that meets the needs of English learners. I'll give you a second to reflect on that if you want to just share what you took away from today's session today, and or share in the chat as well. Yeah, this is a great, after the framework, having the opportunity for training committees is going to be really important. That's right, Shelley. Really making sure that we have a critical lens when reviewing materials will really support our teachers to support our students.